So let me welcome you to Psalm 44, and it's the third of the Korach Psalms. And this too is very distinctive in its feel and very different in how it can be read. So I want to focus in how differently it is read, but first I want to read it to you so you have the larger context. And I'm going to right away go to posting the psalm in front of us so that I can make a distinction for you when you're listening to this psalm. Here's kind of how it's broken down. Verses 1 to 9 is a description of God's power in history. The key word, it occurs 4 times in the first 8 sentences, is the word Hoshea, or Hoshea, that God delivers. So the first 9 verses are about how literally God delivered for the people in the past. And then there's a dramatic turn. Verse 10, the word that begins it marks that transition, the word off, which I translate as yet, but it's like a turn, right? So verses 10, really to the end of the psalm, are a challenge to God. But more specifically, verses 18 to 20, verses 10 to 17 talks about suffering and does it graphically. You know, I often point out the repetition of words. There's not a lot of repeated words, remarkably, in this middle section. And it seems intentional as a way to expand the variety of sufferings the people are enduring in verses 10 to 17. And then the protest, verses 18 to 23, are a challenge to God to say, we were loyal. And verses 24 to 27, the concluding 4 verses, are a prayer or a wake-up call to God. Literally, Ura, wake up, which gets repeated in verse 27. Kuma, get up. The only positive word is the last word, chasdecha. Redeem us for the sake of your kindness. And this notion that we know, God, that you are kind is the one, if you will, ray of light. Now, I will come back to talking about why are they suffering? Is this said by somebody who is, here are going to be the choices, who says, you know, when we were good, God, you were good to us, but now that we have failed, we are suffering, but no, we're prepared to have martyrdom for you, which you will see also proclaimed in verse 23. So therefore, God, we believe in you. So that's model A. We know that you are good, but we weren't always good. Or model B is a post-Holocaust reading, and that is, my faith is shattered. Despite what I was told about you, it hasn't happened in the horror we have confronted. And yet. So 2 possible readings. I'll return to that. But let me now do the reading in that this is 27 verses, and it's a little longer. And I want to make sure I cover everything. I went through a variety of titles, but I chose to quote one of the verses. Why do you hide your face? Psalm 44. For the leader, for the Korachites, a maskil. God, with our ears we have heard, our ancestors have storied us of the deeds that you did in their days. in the days of yore. Your hand dispossessed nations, and you planted them. You smashed peoples and sent them away. For not by their own sword did they inherit the land, nor did their own arm deliver them, but your right hand and your arm and the light of your countenance, because you wanted them. You are my God, you are my guide, O God. Command the deliverance of Jacob. Through you we gore our foes. Through your name we trample those who rise up against us. For not in my bow do I trust, nor with my sword deliver me. For you delivered us from our foes, and those that hate us you put to shame. In God we have gloried all day long, and to your name forever we will give praise. Selah. Yet you neglected us and disgraced us, and did not go forth from our forces, with our forces. You turned us back from the foe, and those that hate us plunder us at their will. You made us like sheep to be eaten, and scattered us among the nations. You sold your people for no wealth, and set no high price upon them. You made us scornful to our neighbors, a derision and mockery to those around us. You made us a byword among the nations, a shaking of the head among the peoples. All day long, my disgrace is before me, and the shame of my face has covered me. For the voice of the taunter and the blasphemer, by reason of the enemy and the revengeful, all this has come upon us. Yet we did not forget you, nor were we false to your covenant. Our heart has not turned back, nor have our steps strayed from your path. Though you have thrust us down to a place of sea monsters and covered us with the shadow of death, if we had forgotten the name of our God, or spread out our hands to an alien God, would not God search this out? For God knows the secrets of the heart. For your sake we are killed all day long. We are counted as sheep for slaughter. Awake! Why do you sleep, O superior? Rouse up. Do not neglect forever. Why do you hide your face and forget our affliction and our oppression? For bowed down to the dust is our spirit. Clinging to the earth is our belly. Arise as a help to us and redeem us for the sake, chasdecha, of your kindness. Now, some things to point out in terms of the way this psalm is so remarkably composed. First of all, verses 1 to 9, as I pointed out, describe how God was there for the people in the past and how the psalmist knows this. Ba'aznenu shema avotenu sapra lanu. For we have heard our ancestors have storied us of the deeds. That is echoing a verse in the Bible. So I'm going to just point out how in verses 1 to 9, there are lots of echoes of phrases of the Bible, which again amplifies this notion that we have heard from our ancestors how you were there for them. So in the story of Exodus, we're told, God says, Uleman tisaper ba'oznei bincha, and I am doing these signs and these wonders so that you will tell them, the same word, saper, same word, ba'aznei, in the ears of your children and your children's children, how I made a mockery of the Egyptians. Hitalalta b'mitzrayim. That's Exodus 10:2. And likewise, Exodus 13, verse 8. Vihigadata levanecha, and you shall tell your children. That same chapter, verse 14. Yeh ki yish'alcha banecha, and it will be when your children will ask you. So this notion that there are the telling of the story of liberation by God, of God's power in history is echoed. And likewise, verse 3, you have a word like Horashta v'tita aim, and you will inherit, and you planted them. The song of the sea, Tivi'emo v'tita emo, you came and you were planted by God. And in verse 4, the description of the sword, not by their own sword did our ancestors inherit the land. In Joshua chapter 24, a description of the challenge not to worship foreign gods. And then verse 12, Lo becharevcha, v'tikaresh otam lo becharevcha, and you shall chase them out, but not with your sword. And later in that same verse, and the light of your countenance for or panecha is Numbers 16, verse 25, the priestly blessings. So verses 1 to 9 are about God's history with the people, and there are echoes of biblical lines throughout it, amplifying that notion of Hoshea, that word that gets repeated 4 times, that God delivers. And yet, now verse 10, and yet you neglected us, zanachta, v'tachliemo, v'tachlimenu, and you disgraced us. In Hebrew, let me also point out that this is largely, let me back up for a moment, this psalm is largely a national statement. It's about the we. But you'll see in verse 5, you are my God, and in verse 7, for not in my bow do I trust, nor with my sword deliver me. You get the sense that the Psalter is speaking in the communal we throughout most of it, but sometimes his own, if you will, emotion surfaces and the I comes through rather than just being the we. And so something to point out, and this is again back to Robert Alter's wonderful teaching the other day, you can't translate a psalm fully. You can't catch the rhythm and the rhyme, particularly rhythm. Psalms are more rhythmic than rhyme, but here, let me just read a little Hebrew to you. Verses 14 to 17, this is again part of the challenge of a description of the suffering. And listen to the language. Tisimenu cherpa lishchenenu, la'ag vakeles lisvivotenu, tasimenu mashal begoyim, menod rosh bal umim, kol hayom, kilimati negdi uvoshet panai kisatni, mikol mecharef megadef, mipnei oyev upmitnakem. So you get a feel that this is rhythmic and even with an element of rhyme to emphasize this kind of marching of suffering that's conveyed in this middle section, the exile's pain. And here's the challenge, verses 18 and 19. Kol zot ba'atnu, all this has come upon us, v'lo shechanuchu, yet we did not forget you, v'lo shekarnu bivritecha, and we were not false, we did not lie concerning your covenant, we were faithful. Verse 19, Lo nasog achar libenu, our heart has not turned back. Ibn Ezra, the Spanish commentator, will add, from firm faith in you. V'teitu shurenu minei archecha, nor have our steps strayed from your path. And so in contrast to the opening that has as the context the covenantal claim repeated in the prophets, in the 5 books of Moses. If you follow my covenant, I will bring the rain in its seasons. But if you are unfaithful, I shall stop up the sky. As if God will intervene. And here the Psalter is saying, we heard the stories, but look at our suffering. And you who know the heart, our heart has not turned back. A challenge to God. Verse 21. If we had forgotten the name of our God or spread out our hands to an alien God, would not God search this out? You would have known it, God, but the implication of the Psalter is you know that that's not true. And yet, verse 23, so powerful. Ki alecha, because it's upon you, or for your sake, we are killed all day long. We are counted as sheep for slaughter. And here with verse 23, you get turning on its head Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He leads me beside green pastures. But here the Psalter says, we're like sheep, but led not to green pastures. We're led to slaughter. Where is our shepherd? And then verse 24, awake. Why do you sleep, O superior? There's a wonderful account in the Talmud that during the Second Temple, there was a group of Levites who would chant Psalm 24. They were called the Me'orarim, according to Sota 48a, the awakeners. But the high priest at that time, Yochanan, forbade them from continuing to chant Psalm 24, lest it be taken literally and people doubt God's wakefulness. Do recall, though we haven't gotten there yet, Psalm 121 verse 4, where we're told God doesn't sleep nor slumber. And so the concern with this line being pulled out was that people would lose faith. Awake, why do you sleep, O superior? Rouse up, do not neglect forever. And so now just some comments on the closing word. The final word is that one ray of light. Looking to the future, arise as a help to us and redeem us for the sake of your kindness. Circle the word kindness. I translate it as kindness. Sometimes it's translated as loving kindness. And some of the translators will say for the sake of your covenantal kindness. I've seen it said that the only time in the Bible that the word chesed is used is in the context of God describing God's kindness in context of covenant. So you do have, for instance, Exodus 34, verse 6. That's Adonai, Adonai, this God's self-description after forgiveness. El Rachum v'Chanun, I am a God of mercy and of graciousness. Erech Apayim v'Rav Chesed, v'Rav Chesed, I am a God of much chesed, kindness. So that's an example of a self-description of God that for some of the commentators points to covenant. You also get it more directly linked to covenant in Deuteronomy 7:9. Ha'el ha'ne'aman, the trustworthy God, Shmar Habrit, who keeps the covenant, v'ha'chesed lo ahavav, and his chesed is kindness. U'lishamrei mitzvotav, to those who keep his commandments. But I tend to see chesed as not just covenant, because it's such an important word for me personally, religiously, namely the pursuit of kindness. Loving kindness could also be said, but that seems to me too many words. So I prefer just to use the word in translation of kindness. Now, the last and the opening question, what is the message of the Psalter? So my mother had a story. My mom, I quote a lot, and she would tell us this story of a mother and a father getting a letter from their son from college. And the father takes this letter and he turns to his wife and says, "Can you imagine? Read this." He's really upset. And she says, "What does it say?" And he says, "Read it. It says, 'Please send me money.'" So she picks up the letter and she says, "No, you didn't read it correctly. It says, 'Please send me money,'" which is to say that we bring our own lenses to what we read, our own emotional predisposition to how we read. So listen to the Art Scroll, their introduction to Psalm 44. This is a paragraph. The sons of Korach depict the early triumphs of our people as they enter the promised land, invincible and armed with Torah laws. They mourn the bitter defeat which our people suffered when they abandoned these divine weapons. Nevertheless, these inspired singers are filled with hope, for even in the exile, the Jewish people have displayed undaunted loyalty to Torah by sacrificing their lives for the sanctification of God's name. Surely this merit will unlock the gates of redemption. So that's an Orthodox reading of faithfulness, that here the Psalter is in a context of acknowledging the failing of the people to be loyal to God and therefore suffering, but willing to martyr themselves like sheep and have so, and trust that God will bring them back. Now that's reading A. The reading that I like to share is reading B, which is how I read it, not just me. It's a reading, a post-Holocaust reading, to know that there are points in our collective history in the aftermath of enormous suffering where you can't help but question God. We, Jews in particular, have a long tradition of challenging God. Abraham did it before Sodom and Gomorrah. Hashofet kol haaretz lo ya'aseh mishpat, will the judge of the world not act justly? We saw, of course, Job challenging God's justice, for Job felt he had not done anything to deserve the loss of family and his own suffering. Later in the Jewish tradition, there is, particularly in the Hasidic realm, the notion based on Abraham and Job of something called a tana, a complaint against God, motivating a din Torah, that you can bring God and put God on trial, right? The judge of the earth won't do justice. You can put God on trial. Elie Wiesel wrote a novel that was a play. Actually, it's not a novel, it's a play called The Trial of God. So it's a Holocaust kind of challenge, but he chose to put it into a pogrom, 1649 specifically, in a town called Shamgorod, in which a town of Jews is wiped out, just a surviving father and daughter who are suffering their loss, and a visitor comes and encounters them, a Jew from another town, and essentially they put God on trial. So that just to say, there is this long tradition of piety and yet seesawing to acknowledge that there are times in which there is, to quote Martin Buber, an eclipse of God. That's a phrase he used to describe the Shoah, and it's taken from this Psalm 2, when it's verse 25. Why lama fanecha tastir? Why do you hide your face? The image there of an eclipse is to say, yes, there is here a ray of faith There is the belief that behind the clouds, there is the presence of God. And that's a statement of faith. God exists. And yet, God is not manifest. Why do you hide your face? Lama fanecha tastir. Verse 24. Tishkach anyenu v'lachadsenu, and forget our affliction and our oppression. Verse 26 marks the lowest point. For bow down to the dust is our spirit. Dafka la'aretz bitnenu, clinging, cleaving to the earth is our stomach. We are not on all hands and feet. We're on our bellies. This is our bottom as a people. The Midrash will say, in reference to that image, Shemot Rabbah 1:9, that in reference to this verse, that when you are in that bottom, that's when you will begin to see light. Therefore, verse 27, Kuma Ezra Talanu, arise as a help to us, redeem us for the sake of Chasdecha, your kindness. So there is still peeking through this darkness of spirit, this having hit bottom of literally, physically, and emotionally in the dust. Yet, that was Elie Wiesel's favorite phrase, and yet, there is a ray of light, a ray of hope in God's kindness. So I particularly, delighted in that verse 10, which is this transition from the history to the experience, that the transition word is off, and yet. I will say this regarding Elie Wiesel, who's such an important teacher for our generation, and I had the privilege to have him as a teacher, is he would say that with the Holocaust, he retained faith, although God became more of a question mark and unknown, rather than the God of his childhood, who was the caring present parent, the Tata in Yiddish, a word used for God, Father, that his faith was transformed but not extinguished. In sum, I am deeply drawn to Psalm 44 as a description of the complexity of faith and the permission of our tradition to express darkness, to express doubt, to challenge, to feel forsaken, to see the gap between the stories received and the reality experienced. And yet, it's included as part of our sacred text, in part, to give that permission, but also because at the core, there's still a ray of light, faith, and hope. With that, I'll stop the text to hear you as my text. I'm delighted to see 24 screens in this, the 47th teaching. It's so gratifying. Again, I'm going to go to Psalm 50, 2 a week, and then pause for the high holidays. So, such a evocative psalm. What did it evoke for you? Please share with us. Let me put this on gallery view. If anybody would like to speak.
I'd like to point out something, please.
Okay, sure, Mike. Keep it to one key idea so we have time for others to share. Go ahead, Mike.
The key word for me here comes in the first verse, in the word maskil, which translates into somebody with sechel, somebody who's smart. And that actually set the tone for me. So whoever wrote it, or whoever wrote it on behalf of, wrote it on behalf of the smart people among the children of Korach, as opposed to the not so smart people who rebelled against Moses. And this is why those smart people, they say, in a way, they're saying, we did not rebel, we followed you, we recognize your greatness, and now they're going to this complaint, and yet then you have done all of those things to us, Even though we're the smart one, we're not the one who rebelled against you. The
Okay,
other
so
ones did.
let me react to that insight, Mike. So this opening verse, the inscription, is for the Korahites, and we've shared that these are of the family of a rebel against Moses, Moses' cousin. And the word is used, a maskil, which in modern Hebrew means intelligent, one who's learned. And the word maskil is not uncommon. We've seen it a number of times already. Even before we got to the Psalms of Korach, we found it in some of the David Psalms as well. And it's a bit, according to scholars like Robert Alter, a little obscure as to what it means. It's sometimes translated as a teaching, so that it comes to teach something that comes from experience. And as Mike emphasizes, as do other classical commentators, the sons of Korach, for whatever reason, and again, it's obscure why or who they are, somehow rejected Korach's rebellion or repented later for it. And that's perhaps part of the context for this psalm. This is a teaching, though I bracket it now on the last level of response, I bracket the introduction in terms of the content for myself, because it's just too ripe with pain, and not a pain I identify necessarily with the sons of Korach. I identify it historically, as do most of the classical commentators, with the pain of exile, which will occur much later. So a psalm written after the destruction of the first temple and gets used at a much later point than the time of Korach or his sons. Another reaction to this psalm, I see Vivian and then Richard. Let me take those two and then we'll pull it together with Kaddish. Go ahead, Vivian, and then Richard. I'll unmute you.
Oh, I'm muted. Let me
You're
see.
unmuted now, Vivian. Go ahead. Whoops, you muted yourself. Let me unmute you again. Okay, you got to unmute yourself. Can you do that?
I can.
Okay, there you, well. Okay, go ahead and unmute, Vivian. I can't hear you. There you are.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Does it work now?
Yes.
Good. I was interested in the name Jacob, which interests me for a number of reasons. It was my father's name, since we mentioned. When I saw that, I saw the entry of the name as a change in the poem, and I wondered if the speaker, the singer, the psalmist, was naming himself as Jacob, and the I following was I, Jacob. Would that make sense? Would that change the meaning of it for you? I'm asking openly. I have no.
Yeah. So Vivian asks, in verse 5, we have the line, and it's a transitional line where he's now gone from the we to being personal. You are my God. You are my guide, O God. Command the deliverance of Jacob. Through you we gore our foes. It's probably not his name. The common expression for Israel is Jacob. So as the children of Jacob become the people of Israel, Bnei Yisrael, it's probably short for command the deliverance of the people of Israel. So Jacob is synonymous with that. Richard?
Yes. When I'm reading this psalm, it seems that between the challenge and or the complaint and the challenge, we have a deep expression of faith in this. and I think that's the way it's supposed to be. In some ways, maybe it's giving a uh, it's showing the way. It seems, at least in my readings of this literature, Hashem really wants us to be, what would you call it, unabashedly honest, and he values that. And I think that's what's being presented here, a kind of honesty of the soul and of the heart that is valued. So anyway, this is what I'm seeing here, is between that this is well, I'll leave it at that. I won't.
So I'm going to reframe what I heard you say, Richard, and that is, what I hear you saying is two things. This is a psalm deeply grounded in faith,
Yes.
and yet with permission to vent, to express one's greatest doubts and
Right.
anger even over the reality of the moment. But coming back to the first point, it still points to promise because of faith. And I think that's true. And that's something distinctive we saw it once in a previous psalm that used the word Shoah. And here we get it again. In that sense, this psalm does not stand alone, either in psalms or in sacred literature, as a challenge to God. And it is something that's different about, if you will, Jewish piety, that there is permission to vent and to challenge. That's another thing Elie Wiesel would say in reference to God after the Holocaust. You can express your anger to God, but that's very different than dismissing the reality of a listening presence. So clearly, that's the context. This is a psalm to God. God is the audience, but with the confidence that God can take it, that you can be, to use your word, Richard, honest with God. And we know in any relationship, there's upset. There's times where you just want to scream, and permission is given to scream. And that's this psalm. And in that regard, it's an extreme within psalms, more than the other psalm. The language, the imagery of the suffering and God's ignoring their goodness. You, God, know our secrets, and you know we've been faithful. There's that, again, I'm feeling the aftermath of the Holocaust, which I know in my bones from this Holocaust survivors I've known, which is, this makes no sense. If God cares, where was God? But a choice is made in the psalm, not fully to reject God, to express the pain and to say, and yet, God, get up. I know you are a God of kindness. Let me see it. So in that sense, it's a statement profoundly of faith. A heads up for tomorrow. Psalm 45 is not to God. In that sense, it's a very distinctive psalm. It's a royal psalm to a king and a queen. It hardly mentions God, other than acknowledging that the king sits on a throne of God. In that sense, it's secular and remarkable in how it describes the life of the palace, the nature of being a king and a queen. And some commentators will say it was for a wedding, though they won't agree as for who the wedding was to be held for. But it's for a king and a queen, a very different kind of psalm, also a psalm of Korach, Psalm 45. So we conclude today with Kaddish. I invite those who have a need to honor a loved one passed, either yurtzeit or in mourning, to join with me as I now share the screen of Kaddish, as we traditionally, who are saying Kaddish, rise to join together. Yitkadal v'yitkadash Shemei Rabbah,
Amen.
Bialma divra kirute viamlich malchute v'chayechon uvyomechon uvchaye dechol beit Yisrael v'agala uvizman kari vimru amen.
Amen.
Yehi Papa mevorach le'olam
Amaya.
Barach
Yitbarach
v'yishtabach
v'yitpa'ar
v'yitramam
Yitramam
v'yitnaseh
Yitnaseh
v'yitadar
V'yitaleh
v'yitaleh
Yitalav
Shemei
Shmei Tikurusha Brichu
Le'ela
Eila Min Kol
birchata
Birchata
v'shirata
V'shirata Tushbechata
v'nechemata
V'nechemata
da'amira
Damiran
v'alma
B'alma V'imru
v'imru
Amen.
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 Yehi
Yehi Shlama Rabba
Rabba
Nushmaya
Maya v'chayim
Kayim
aleinu
Aleinu
v'al
Kol
Yisrael
Yisrael
v'imru
V'imru
amen.
Amen.
Osei
Oseh Shalom
shalom b'mramav na'aseh shalom
Hu Yaseh Shalom
aleinu
Aleinu V'al
v'al
Kol
Yisrael
Yisrael
v'kol
V'al
yoshvei
Kol Yoshvei
tevel
Tevel
v'imru
V'imru Amen.
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 Thank you for gathering to learn Psalm 44 today. Blessings to each of you for a good day. Another heads up, tomorrow I'm doing an interview at 12:30 with a cousin who is a full-time sports writer covering the Celtics for an online magazine called The Athletic. And he wrote recently a lengthy article on anti-Semitism, which I hope is posted. If not, Eric, please post that site along with the announcement for the talk. And tomorrow night, 8:30, I believe, double check, is Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av. And we will be reading from the book of Lamentations, marking destruction of the first and second temples. And again, on Thursday, we're not meeting for Psalms, but in honor of Tisha B'Av, a 5 p.m. Mincha service, the only afternoon service traditionally where you put on tefillin. So a lot tomorrow, continuing to Thursday. Thank you for joining today. All the best.